We started this discussion by making this distinction between prescriptive or moral prescriptions or precepts, and also theoretical discussions of moral, which is usually in ethics called meta-ethics, discussions about the nature of ethics. Now, under this discussion, we looked at several important theories. Now, as the basis, we started our discussion last week referring to the Kalama Sutta, where Buddha gives a list of 10 things we must not take as sole authority in deciding what is good and bad, or kusala and akusala. Now, this Kalama Sutta is a very, very important discourse by the Buddha, because when we look at the moral philosophy of Buddhism, when we think about the authority, I mean, who has the authority to make moral decisions? Now, when you, in the Kalama Sutta, you see that these 10 are basically what has been considered to be the moral authorities. Either you go by the religious text, what is in the religious text, or by any other kind of authority, or by logicality, or by your tradition. So these are basically the moral authorities we go when we try to make moral decisions. But here, interestingly, Buddha says, don't take any of these things. But then important thing is, when Buddha says not to go by these things, it doesn't necessarily mean that these sources are wrong. What it means is they are not sufficient, they are not satisfactory. In other words, you should not accept something simply because your tradition says. If your tradition says something to be good, okay, but then you further investigate it. Ultimately, interestingly, the moral authority is yourself. The word used are yada tumhe kalama attana vajaniyat, when you know for yourself. Okay. Now, interestingly, when we say that you are the authority, the problem is that does that mean that anybody and everybody in the society is capable of making moral judgments? Now, that I think we need to discuss. We discussed a little bit last week. We need to discuss even a little bit more further today. So, basically, what is to be kusala and akusala are judged based on the condition of the mind, lobha dosa moha or alobha dosa moha. And moving from there, the other aspect highlighted is the outcome of such an action. Now, the consequence, outcome of an action. Now, very important area in the Buddhist tradition where we lay emphasis on outcome is karma, karma and its result, action and the action's result. Now, again in Buddhism, Buddha does not teach that karma determines everything. In other words, karma is not deterministic. And also, importantly, there is no any agent who determines the vipaka or the result of the karma. Now, according to, for example, theistic religions, when you do something wrong, you are punished. Now, the concept of punishment in the context of religion is you are punished by somebody. Okay? You are punished by somebody. It's like you violating a rule in the daily life, you are punished by the government. In the same manner, if you do something wrong, you are punished by God. So you have the action and the punishment. Now, there is a very important difference here in the karma theory. You have an action, but the nature of the action determines what the result is. So it is not conceptualized as karma and punishment, action and punishment. We don't conceptualize that way. In other words, there is no somebody, some person, some authority who determines what kind of consequence you should get. The consequence is determined by the nature of the action itself. Right? Manasa che paduttena bhasativa karotiva. Manasa che pasannena bhasativa karotiva. If you do something with defiled mind, if you do something pleasant mind, you get a good result. Who decides? Nobody decides. It is only your action decides. So it's, in other words, in Buddhism, karma is a category that comes under causal theory, Paticcasamuppada. Paticcasamuppada basically talks about imasmin sati idang hoti. When certain causes and conditions are there, certain type of consequences there. So again, Paticcasamuppada is a very natural process. Behind the Paticcasamuppada process, there is no some agent, divine or otherwise. Okay? So karma theory is also coming under the Paticcasamuppada. So karma theory is an example, the example of how Paticcasamuppada process works. Okay. So karma and its result is a very important aspect of when we talk about consequence. And then I referred to Bahitika Sutta. Then elaborating on that, we referred to Ambalatthika Rahulovada Sutta, where Buddha gives this criterion, neva attabhyabadhaya, na parabhyabadhaya, na ubhayabhyabadhaya. So the criterion is, if an action is causing harm to yourself, harm to the others, harm to yourself and other both, then you should not do that action. If an action is not leading to harm to yourself, the other and both, then you should do this action. Now, important thing is this. Owing to this emphasis on consequences of action, scholars say that Buddhism advocates a consequentialist approach to ethics. I refer to P.D. Premasiri, and also another scholar in Buddhist ethics is Damien Keown. You should have these texts actually in the library. So Professor Premasiri's text is with you. If you read this carefully, I hope you have read it by now, you can see that he says that this consequentialist approach to Buddhist ethics. Now, although it looks the consequence is a very important thing, but when you take consequence alone as moral theory, there are some kind of difficulties, some kind of problems. Now the question is Buddhist ethical theory consequentialist? I'm using this word in the ethical discussions. You get this term consequentialism and consequentialist. Buddhism lays much emphasis on happiness as the criterion of good actions. Does this mean that Buddhist ethics is utilitarian? Now I introduce two terms here. One is utilitarianism, the other is consequentialism or consequentialist approach. What is this utilitarianism? I'm sorry. Now the key word here is utility. Utilitarianism. Now this view is something developed by some English philosophers in modern ethics. Mill, J.S. Mill, basically. Now this view says that any action is judged on utility. Particularly they talk about how much happiness people derive, for how many people it is applicable. Now based on these issues, matters, you decide whether you should do something or not, whether an action is good or not. So this utilitarianism is important idea. It's based on the concept of happiness. Now I think in some sense between Buddhism and utilitarianism there is a shared idea of happiness. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that the happiness utilitarianism means is exactly like the happiness in the Buddhist literature we are talking about, but basically the concept of happiness. Buddhism lays much emphasis on happiness as the criterion of good actions. And we know basic concept that people are there to gain happiness, to be happy. You know, this is a fundamental idea in Buddhism. Now we say that nirvana, nibbana paramang sukhang, the happiness as nirvana as the highest, or in other words, highest happiness is nirvana. So all of us are trying to realize nirvana, which is the highest happiness. Okay? Now the whole conceptualization in Buddhism based on dukkha. Now the Four Noble Truths, if you take the Four Noble Truths, the central conception is dukkha. Even though we say there are four truths, but the central idea is dukkha, right? Dukkha, rising of dukkha, cessation of dukkha, path leading to the cessation of dukkha. So dukkha is the central idea. Now we want to change this life because as Puthujjana beings we undergo suffering. Now if that is true, then happiness is the goal. Now happiness can be defined in many different manners in Buddhist tradition. Gihi sukha, pabbajita sukha, the happiness of lay people, happiness of monastic communities, and happiness you gain by attaining jhana, attaining magga, phala, and then when you cleanse yourself of defilements at the Sotapatti level, then you are pure up to that extent, and then you are also happy up to that extent. And finally when you become an arahant, you are completely purified and all the defilements are gone. Because all the defilements are gone, no causes of dukkha. When all the causes of dukkha are gone, you are happy. So, this concept of happiness is central in Buddhism. And utilitarianism also, they go by the happiness produced by an action. So, they say that an action is preferable to the extent that it produces happiness. So, maximum happiness for maximum number of people will be the best action. If an action produces biggest amount of happiness for largest amount of people. So, that is the idea. Okay. So, the maximum happiness for maximum number of people, that is the utilitarian view. Now, the issue is that when in Buddhism we say we ultimately derive happiness by cleansing ourselves. So, it comes from the purity. However, in the utilitarian tradition, it is clear that they are not talking about that type of happiness. Okay? Although we use the concept of in Pali sukha. Okay, in Pali sukha. In English we use the term happiness. But what do we really mean by these two are really we need to be very carefully analyzed. But in Buddhism, you know that we talk about the concept of what is called samisa sukha, niramisa sukha. The concept here is amisa. So, amisa is basically, amisa can be translated in many different ways, but amisa basically refers to things, stuff, things we get, amisa, things you need in order to live. So, like property, money, buildings, other instruments, all these things are amisa. So, there is what is called samisa sukha, the happiness deriving from having lot of things, amisa, when you have amisa. So, actually this word amisa is used in the context of monastic life. So, when you gain so many things, you have so much amisa, and owing to it you are happy. So, niramisa means the happiness not associated with things. Okay? Happiness not associated with stuff. Happiness not associated with having so much. Now, this is a very important issue here when in the utilitarianism, when they talk about maximum happiness for maximum people, it's important to understand what kind of happiness they are talking. Whether it is they are talking samisa sukha or niramisa sukha. Now, clearly they cannot be talking of niramisa sukha. They must be talking of samisa sukha. Actually, that is maybe the distinction between happiness and also pleasure. Now, when we say pleasure we derive from enjoying things, pleasure. Okay? But happiness is something different. Say, when you give something you have to someone as a donation, you are happy. But when you are enjoying some good food or something, you have a pleasure. So, the pleasure seems to be more connected to samisa sukha. And the happiness, you are happy often by doing something good, doing something ethical. It doesn't mean that, unethical people are not happy. People can be happy doing nasty things also. But, basically this samisa sukha and niramisa sukha is something very interesting. So, you do something if it produces happiness. Now, when you take this criterion given in the Ambalattika Rahulovada Sutta, Neva atta vyabadhaya, paravyabadhaya ube. Vyabadha means harm, discomfort. So, the vyabadha. vyapada, that means the harm. And so Buddha says that don't do anything that produces harm to, discomfort to anybody. But this view has been expressed in many different ways. In the Dhammapada you have places like natang kammang katang sadhu yang katva anutappati. Don't do anything that if you will have to regret having done it, and so on. So this the outcome of an action is very much connected to this idea. So you must not do something that produces unhappiness. Do something that produces happiness. Now, attabhyabhadaya, parabhyabhadaya, ubhyabhyabhadaya. To you, to the other, and to both. Now you can see that there is a very strong, we can say, consequentialist approach in Buddhism. Okay? But the problem is, sometimes if you take this as the only criterion, now in the Buddhist tradition, we are talking about by happiness something dissociated with lobha dosa moha. Now something dissociated with lobha dosa moha cannot be wrong, cannot be bad for the others. But the issue is this: if you take the utilitarian idea of maximum happiness for maximum number of people as a criterion of doing something, that happiness is not really associated with alobha, adosa, amoha in the Buddhist sense. Now which means that they can be associated with lobha, dosa, moha. But something associated with lobha, dosa, moha can be producing pleasure or happiness to larger number of people. So it means that if it produces happiness for larger number of people, then you should do that. But is that correct according to Buddhism? Is that acceptable according to Buddhism? Now again the problem is this. On the one hand, in Buddhism you find that consequence is a very important thing. However, when Buddhism talks about consequence, Buddhism associated with it happiness. Now happiness is basically the idea that something associated with alobha, adosa, amoha. So which are good states of mind. Now if you have alobha, dosa, amoha, you cannot be doing something bad or wrong to the people, right? So this is the Buddhist aspect. But on the other hand, when we take utilitarian aspect, the producing maximum happiness for maximum number of people, what do we really mean by happiness? It's most probably not associated with alobha, dosa, moha, but associated with lobha, dosa, moha. Then it can produce questionable outcome. And also associated with that, the problem is when you say you do something producing happiness for maximum number of people, what about the other people? Suppose we want to do something here and then we take a vote. Suppose there are 50 people here. We say 30 people say yes to something and 20 people say no to it. But then going by the majority, we say we do what is preferred by 30 people, right? So what about the other 20 people? The other 20 people don't like it. Then but according to this theory, if maximum amount of happiness for maximum number of people, we go for the majority, right? But does majority mean that majoritarian view is always the correct view? I mean 30 people hold a view, 20 people hold another view. Can this view be correct simply because it is held by more people? Can't it be that the view held by less number of people is the really correct view? Do you see the difference here? One is the numbers, like democracy. We go for the numbers. So we simply say that whatever has the larger number is the better. But then does that really mean that the view or the standpoint held by the larger number is morally and ethically right? You know, this is an interesting ethical question. Now, we all accept democracy, right? We go for the the larger majority always. Of course, larger majority like something means it is acceptable and it is preferred by larger majority. So implementation is much easier because more people like it. But however, whether there is a connection between majority and the rightness. In other words, whether the majoritarian view is always the right view. Okay? I mean, whether the idea preferred by a larger number of people, whether it is the right view. So what is the connection between this rightness and idea preferred by the larger majority of people? The question is, is this equation is correct? Majority equals correctness. That means larger number of people preferring something means that that is the correct one. I think we should not, I mean there is a confusion here. We should not be victims to it because the majority holding a view is one thing. Something being popular is one thing. On the other hand, something being correct is, something else. Sometimes it is possible that, majority likes the correct view. It's not impossible. But on the other hand, the majority must not be the only criterion to decide whether it is right or wrong. In the Dhammapada, one place Buddha says, Dussilo hi bahujjano. Dussilo hi bahujjano. Large majority are dussila. Larger majority of people are dussila. Now, if larger majority of people are dussila, then can we say that they can make the right choice? Because, they are dussila, their lack of sila affects, influences their decision, right? So, when we think about this, on the one hand, we can say that Buddhism emphasis much, less much emphasis on consequence, and the view in ethics is utilitarian view. Now, utilitarian view goes by the amount of calculus is maximum happiness for maximum number of people. Is that necessarily morally correct? And this is something very interesting for you to think. Now, it is possible that many people hold one view, but it is also possible that only one person or few people hold different view. But that different view is really correct. Then, you can't go by majority preference. I will give you an example from Buddhism. Now, if you take the Buddha, today millions of people accept what the Buddha said. Of course, it is not only for Buddhism, for you take any religion. Now, we take the example from Buddhism. So, the Buddhism means larger, the millions of people in the world accept what the Buddha said. What does it mean? Does it not mean that millions of people accept what one person says? So that means that one person is correct versus millions of people, isn't it? Okay? Now, initially, if you look at it, that is how it started. When Buddha started saying things, people accepted it. and then it becomes the idea of those people. Today Buddhism has become idea of many millions of people. However, that is the idea of one person at some point. So you can see that entire world versus one person. One person says something, and then larger majority of people accept that it is the right thing. Okay? So you can see that something being correct and something being preferred by larger number of people doesn't mean really much, because a larger number of people may prefer some wrong ideas. That also you can see some popular movements in the world. Some ideas are wrong ideas, but they are being accepted by many people. So, the right and wrong of an idea is something. Whether those ideas are preferred by other people is another thing. So, when we look at from that point of view, we can say that majoritarian view doesn't necessarily mean that it is always correct. Okay. However, what democracy, what majoritarian view is really in society, when you want to implement something, when you want to do something, it is always good to get the majority consent. Then it is easy to do. And also there can be certain situations where you really have to look for, when you do something, whether it is useful for the majority. For example, let me give you some rough example. Suppose all of us are suffering from some illness. If there are 50 people here, 40 people suffer from one kind of illness, 10 people suffer from another kind of illness. But these both illnesses will not cause you death, but illness. Then if you have limited money, it is justifiable that you spend money on 40 people, not the 10 people, right? Of course, if you can spend money on both 40 people and 10 people, that is good. But if you don't have enough resources, then it is good that you look at 40 people's discomfort and do something for the 40 people, not for the 10 people, simply because you go by the numbers. That is one option. Also imagine 40 people are suffering from something, but that is not very dangerous. But the 10 people are suffering from something that can be leading to death. Then what should we do? Then we should give the medicine to the 10 people. Because if they are not given medicine, they will be dead. But if the 40 people, although they are suffering from illness, they will not die. Now you see, it is very difficult to have fixed answer to this type of questions. Like in mathematics, you don't have fixed answers. In mathematics, you say always 2 plus 2 equals 4. But in this kind of issues, you can't have that type of answer. So depending on, there can be certain situations where we should look at the majority. Or there can be certain situations we should look at the minority, less number and the more number. But it depends on, right? It depends on. So when we look at Buddhism, although Buddhism says much emphasis on happiness as the criterion of good actions, does this mean that Buddhist ethics is utilitarian? The answer is really no. Although Buddhism has a strong consequentialist element, the most important thing is when Buddhism says something is good, actually Buddhism looks at both from Samisa and Niramisa. For lay people, ordinary society, you can talk about Samisa. But ultimately, if you are talking about Nirvana, we are talking about Niramisa happiness, right? So the Niramisa happiness is quite different from ordinary Samisa happiness of ordinary people. Maybe ordinary people may not want Niramisa happiness. More than Niramisa happiness, they can be wanting food, clothing, and beautiful clothing, and things like that. So it depends on. So one thing is very important is in this type of situation, it is very difficult to decide on exactly one particular answer. It depends on many factors. We have to consider many factors. So therefore, utilitarianism basically means that you do something that produces maximum happiness for maximum number of people. But it could be leading to some serious difficulties. Another situation is when you go for maximum number of people, we always have a problem of few number of people who do not come into that. And then implicitly, indirectly, it is like we are saying, okay, forget about this small number of people. Always look at the larger number of people. But is that okay? I mean, can we really let a small number of people die for the sake of happiness of large number of people? It is very difficult to go by the numbers. But basically, for the relative easiness of implementation, we go by the numbers. That is what very often a democratic society does. However, if we think carefully, in a democratic system, if you can have the correct view, and then if you can get the larger majority for the correct view, then of course it will be a good thing. Because implementation is easy, putting it into action is easy when many people like it. Okay? But the very fact that many people like it doesn't make it right, or doesn't make it wrong either. But so what we need to do is, in a democratic system, if we can get the right view to be the majority view, which means educating people. When you educate people, they tend to hold the right view. So when you hold the right view, and then it is, if the larger majority hold the right view, then it is easy to implement it, put it into action. Now anyhow, these are some of the issues when we think about consequentialist approach. Now in Buddhism, although Buddha goes by the consequence or the outcome of an action, outcome of an action is not the only one. For some action to be judged correct, outcome is not the only one. Okay? We look at outcome. Buddha says look at the outcome. And as I said, the outcome is happiness, and the happiness we interpret in as Niramisa Sukha. Then of course, it doesn't, it cannot have the usual difficulties this idea has. Okay? So because we give a different interpretation to the concept of happiness, namely Niramisa happiness. Now in the ethics, field of ethics itself, there are some very interesting ideas. Particularly, we have another philosopher called Immanuel Kant, who really rejected this utilitarian view. So the Kant's ethical philosophy is a form of absolutism, according to which he held that ethical actions must be so under any circumstance. This is described as categorical imperative. I am not really going into very much deep into this, because in order to understand Kant's ethical theory, you really have to do a lot more reading. But in this class, we are not really going into that much deep. But let me give you just a very brief introduction. Now, utilitarian theory says that go for maximum happiness for maximum number of people. So, which means that according to Kant's analysis, you go by what is good for the maximum number of people. But as I said earlier, that does not mean that what is preferred by maximum number of people does not mean that it is the right thing. But when we see Kant, Kant is a philosopher who lived in 18th and 19th centuries. 18th century, I am sorry, 18th century. He had this idea called categorical imperative. Now, what this means is really he thought that ethics or ethical theories have to be categorical imperative. What he meant by this is something unchanging, absolute, not changing depending on time or space, something universal. Now, according to Kant, ethical theories have to be universal. Now, what he meant by universal is ethical theories must be applicable to all people everywhere. So, if something is right, it has to be right under all circumstances. If something is wrong, it has to be wrong under all circumstances. So, what he meant by categorical imperative is whenever you do something, that something you do has to be in accordance with a universal criterion or universal standard. In other words, you must be able to universalize it. In other words, if you do something, if it is good for you, according to Kant, it has to be good for not only to you, to everybody. It has to be universally good. But you can't do something simply because it is good for you. Or you can't do something simply because it is good for the larger majority. So, in Kant's view is completely opposite to this view. Kant thought that something has to be good if it is, in order something to be good, it has to be universally good. It has to be explained according to universal theory. So, in this sense, you do not have regional differences in ethics. Actually, if Kant's view is what we call it's a form of absolutism, what is opposite of Kant's view is what is called relativism. So, absolutism and relativism. Absolutism says that if something is good, it has to be absolutely good. If something is bad or wrong, it has to be absolutely bad or wrong. Absolutely means not conditional. You can't say it is good here, it is not good there. So, no time and space, universally applicable, that is what is called absolutism. However, when we talk about relativism, the relativism in ethics says that ethical theories are relative. Now, relative means relative to the situations, relative to places or time and space. Some things we can say considered to be good before, but now they are not considered to be good. Things like that. Time changes. And also certain things considered to be good in one place may be not good to be, maybe not good in some other place. So, time and space constraints. Relativism means ethics can be changing according to time and space. Now, this is true in some sense, like when you go from culture to culture, when you go from country to country, you can see that in different countries there are ways of behavior. So, people think that to behave in a certain way is good in certain countries or certain cultures, to behave in a certain way is not good in certain cultures. Now, it depends on the culture. Something accepted in one culture is not accepted in another culture. Something considered to be good in one culture is not considered to be good in another culture. Now, we know that this is a basic thing. When you travel around places, even within one country, you know that things get changed. Now, the idea that good and bad are relative, that is one idea. But the opposite idea is to say that no, good and bad are not relative. I mean, what we are talking about, the customs and habits and things can be changing, but according to this view, good and bad has to be universally applicable, good and bad. Now, these are the two views. These are the two views. So, of course, this issue you have to really study more and think on your own. Also, we can think on this looking from a Buddhist point of view, whether Buddhism is an absolutism or whether Buddhism is a relativism. But Kant's philosophy, we are just ethical views we are referring to here. He thought that any ethical action must be universal. Now, this universalizability, it must be, you must be able to universalize it, universally applicable. But that is really, as an ethical theory, very serious condition, right? Because when you do whatever you do, if you really think that it must be universalizable always, that is a very stringent, very strict criterion. But this was what Kant thought. And he also said that you cannot use a human being as an means. You must consider human being as an end in itself. Now, in ethical discussions, we use in these two terms, means and end. Now, means means you follow certain procedures and methods to achieve something, and end means what you expect finally by doing that. Means is the ways of doing something. Ends means the final goals or final things you try to achieve by that. So, these two concepts, means and ends. Okay? In order to achieve something, you follow some means. Okay? You follow some means. But here, basically, according to Kant, you cannot really use human beings as a means to an end. Human being has to be an end in itself. In other words, we cannot use a human being in order to fulfill our personal selfish goals. Human being has to be considered as a end in itself. Now, this is another way of saying what is categorical imperative. But basically what is meant by categorical imperative is that he says that you must do any action so that that action can be, you can will or you can think that action to be applicable universally. So that is what he meant by categorical imperative. In simple language, categorical imperative is something like this: you must always do something only if it is universally applicable. So this is the categorical imperative. You must always do something only if it is universally applicable, right? I mean, if it is applicable only to you, only to your gain, then this says that you must not do this. Okay. So he has some other ways also expressing this, but this is the main, the manner he has expressed this. Not exactly the words, but idea is the same. So you must always do something only if it is universally applicable. Now this type of thing, actually this type of theories, we say these are absolutism. When we say something is absolutism, we know that there are no exceptions for it. Absolutism means there are no exceptions. You can't change it. Under no circumstance this will change. Nowhere. And not at any time. So no time and space constraint are applicable or relative, relevant to this. But when we say relativism, relativism means ethics can be different on different places. Ultimately the problem of absolutism and relativism, of course we can go on talking about this, but absolutism, as Kant says, will not be easy at all for people to practice, okay, because ethical actions are extremely difficult then. But on the other hand, when we say relativism, relativism can be depending on places. Only problem is that if you say ethics are relative, good and bad is relative to different cultures, different societies, that same argument can be applicable to say that ethics are relative to each person. So my ethics is different from your ethics. Then what happens? If there are billion people in the world, there can be billion ethical theories, ethical standpoints. But that is also not impossible. This is something very interesting when you think from the Buddhist point of view. Now for example, for the lay people, Buddha gives Panchasila. Now Panchasila is considered to be universal, isn't it? Panchasila is considered to be universal anywhere in the world. But Buddhism doesn't say this is absolute. But Buddhism says these are the basic principles to be observed by all the lay people. Okay. Now there can be some practical problems. Say for example, when there are no trees, no plants, only there is fish to eat, can people be still observing the first precept? Can people be without fishing? These are some of the problems. But if you keep aside those exceptions, then we can say that killing is bad is universal. The stealing is bad is universal. There can be some exceptions. But whenever you accept exceptions, then it is not absolutism. However, in the Buddhist ethics, we feel that if you take 5 precepts, there can be exceptions. But there can be exceptions, but still the ideas are, the precepts are considered to be applicable universally under normal circumstances, we say. So the Buddhist position, whether they are absolute or not, is something for us to be considered. Now when we take Buddhist Vinaya, there is a very interesting story in the discourses. There was one bhikkhu, one monk, who complained that he cannot observe all the 150 sikkhapadas. Actually by that time there have been only 150. Now we have 200 plus. Then what the Buddha said? Buddha said that, okay, no problem. Buddha asked, can you observe 3 things? And he said very happily, yes. Because his problem is, he can't observe 150, too many. But then when the Buddha said, can you observe 3? He said willingly yes. But within that 3, of course, all these things come. So when he agreed to observe 3, Buddha said, forget about 150, you do only these 3. But then when you do these 3, naturally, all your 150 or 220 are preserved. Now you see here the interesting thing is, so that is not absolutism, right? That's not absolutism. But on the other hand, so you don't go by the letter of the precept. But if you take the philosophy of the precept, then you can see that observing Adisila Sikha, Adi Chitta Sikha, Adi Panya Sikha is equal to observing all the precepts. So Buddha said, observe only these 3 things. Now that approach is not absolutist approach. Okay? But how to, come into understanding Buddhist position, we need to look at many aspects like this. Now earlier I said to you, anything that is with Lobha Dosa Moha is wrong, bad. Anything that is with Lobha Dosa Moha is akusala. Now if anything with Lobha Dosa Moha is akusala, we can in a way say that anywhere in the universe, if you do something with Lobha Dosa Moha, that is wrong. Anywhere in the universe, if you do something with Alobha Dosa Moha, you can say that is good, kusala. Now is that absolutism? Is that absolutism? We need to think about it, because it looks like when Buddha says that anything that you do with Lobha Dosa Moha is bad, the initial idea is that Lobha is not good, Dosa is not good, Moha is not good. Okay? Lobha Dosa Moha are not good. Now if we agree with that, so any action you do with those things can be wrong. And then Alobha Dosa Moha is good. But someone can argue, someone can say that, look at the ordinary household life, where you need to do business and make money. Isn't it Lobha? Isn't it Lobha? So how can you say anything you do is with Lobha is bad? Now again, here we need to be very careful. What the Buddha says is, anything you do with Lobha is akusala. But that does not necessarily mean it is a papa. You remember 2 days ago we were discussing akusala and papa and punya papa and akusala and kusala. So when you do, we can say in a way, when you do business and earn money, make profit, it is Lobha. But does that mean that it is wrong? Is it wrong to do business? If you are getting excessive profit, that is wrong. But if you are getting reasonable profit by business, that is good. You do a business in order to get a profit. So that's perfectly okay. Now you see in Buddhist ethics, again we have to make a distinction here. Okay? Because ordinary human life is, Lobha. Basically Lobha. Maybe we can say more, dosa we can reduce. But without Lobha, you can't do things. So we are motivated by Lobha. In a way, that doesn't necessarily mean that Lobha is always a papa. You study in order to get a degree. Lobha. Although you study Dhamma, still it is Lobha. Because you want to get a degree and then you want to get a certificate, you want to get pictures, you want to put in the Facebook. All these things are Lobha, isn't it? But Lobha is not necessarily a bad thing in that sense. So you see, these things, you have to really be, look at all these different aspects when we are trying to decide whether something is good or whether something is bad, okay? So in that sense we can say, when we look at this absolutism and relativism, in a way Buddhism believes in what is to be Lobha, Dosa, Moha to be not akusala, alobha dosa moha to be kusala. But basically this perspective, this view is for those who are trying to attain nirvana directly. But if you take the household life, where of course they also want to attain nirvana, but they are following a very roundabout way. Lobha dosa moha are not always bad, but they remain akusala. But maybe ordinary people live with akusala, although not with papa. We need to make this distinction very carefully. Okay. So when we look at Buddhist tradition, we can say at some level, we can say that certain things are, provided certain conditions, we can say they are more sure, absolute. But in this debate, I do not want to use these two terms. Buddhism is whether absolutism or whether Buddhism is relativism in ethics. Both these terms have their own problems. Okay? So now if you want to decide what is the Buddhist position, we can see that certain aspects of absolutism are there, and also certain aspect of relativism about certain things. Now there are certain Vinaya rules. Actually when I am talking about Vinaya and Sila, I will be elaborating it on more in my maybe future discussions. But basically there are certain rules Buddha changed. But those rules are really nothing to do with kusala kusalo punya papa. Buddha said that to monks where not to take bath every day in Majjhima Desa. But of course away from Majjhima Desa is okay. Not to wear shoes in Majjhima Desa. But beyond Majjhima Desa, they are good. Now here you can see that certain precepts are applicable only in the Majjhima Desa and not beyond that. But then wearing a shoe or taking bath every day, are they moral acts? Are they morally right or wrong? They are not usually. Unless there is a shortage of water and there is not enough water to take bath every day, then if somebody takes bath every day, that is an act of selfishness. But taking a bath has nothing to do with morality. It is neither moral nor immoral, right? Wearing shoes is nothing moral nor immoral. So you can see that Buddha has been changed in certain rules without, depending on the place. So certain things that are good in the Majjhima Desa, maybe not good when you go outside. Same thing, certain things you do here in Myanmar, you will not be able to behave in the same way when you go to other country. But those are okay. So you can see that morality in certain sense can be relative, even the Buddhist morality. But when you come to kusala, akusala, you can see that kusala, akusala definition has been pretty much stable. Whether you go to Myanmar or to Iceland or United States, kusala will be kusala, akusala will be akusala. So long as we go by this definition of lobha dosa moha and alobha dosa moha. So on the one hand we have utilitarianism of people who talk about the maximum happiness for maximum people. You decide whether something is moral or immoral, right or wrong, based on the idea whether it is profitable or not, utility. And then we have Kant's view, completely opposite to that. No, your actions must be universally applicable actions, otherwise not to do things. I mean, it will be humanly almost impossible to do that type of action. But as a moral theory, it is very interesting. As a moral theory, according to Kant, you must really forget yourself. You can't do something unless, even though it is good for you, unless it is good for everybody else. You can't do. So you can't be selfish according to this theory. Okay. So anyhow, we need to know more about Kant's theory. But in Professor Premaseri's analysis of Buddhist ethics, he says that Buddhist ethics seems to be consequentialist. Actually, consequentialism or the regard for the consequence of an action is very much there. But my judgment is, in Buddhism, the consequence is not the only one. I mean, consequence is considered, but consequence is not the only one. Only one criterion. There can be other criteria. Okay. So basically, I think these two ideas, whether something is relative or whether something is absolute, whether we can have moral theories, the absolute theories is something interesting. So finally, I raise this question: is Buddhist ethics relative or absolute? Does Buddhism hold that there are universally valid ethical principles? I leave this question open to you. I am not going to answer this question, but you can think about. You can think about what type of. In a way, you can say. What is with Lobha Dosa Moha is wrong under any circumstance. What is with Alobha Dosa Moha is right under any circumstance. But then again, as I showed you, the same thing cannot be applicable to ordinary household people. Okay. So then that means that even this kusala akusala distinction is not universally applicable for practical reasons. But you can say that, okay, practical reasons is yes, but whether it is practical or not, but Lobha Dosa Moha is wrong. Then what? We are going to some kind of absolutist position. But as I showed you, household life may be impossible without lobha, without some kind of desire, without some kind of attachment. Right? Anyhow, these are difficult issues we need to. We don't have really a one very correct answer. Now, this concept, the acceptable forms of authority, adhipateya in Buddhism. Adhipateya, adhipati. Adhipati means authority. Adhipati means authority. Now, acceptable forms of authority in Buddhist ethics. Now, why I come to this question is, you remember in the Kalama Sutta, we discussed earlier, Buddha says that not to accept based on certain authorities. A religious authority, authority of reason, basically based on these two things, Buddha says not to accept. When Buddha says ma anussavena, that means anussava, religious authority, textual authority must not be the only criterion of accepting something good. So in other words, Buddha doesn't seem to like authority when it comes to moral decisions in life. In other words, according to Buddhism, you must not make moral decisions being subject to some authority, simply because you can't go beyond that authority. Having said that, if you look at here, you can see that there is another interesting thing. Although the Buddha rejected various types of authority as unsatisfactory criteria of moral action, there are some other authorities accepted as proper in making moral judgment. So Buddha rejected certain forms of authority, but on the other hand, Buddha seems to be accepting certain other forms of moral authority. Now what are they? One is one's own conscience, attadhipateya. Another is the world, the intelligent people in the world, lokadhipateya. The third is the Dhamma, the teaching of the Buddha, Dhammadhipateya. So we have Atta, Loka, Dhamma as Adhipateya. Adhipateya means authority. Something that puts kind of pressure on you, some kind of power that you have to consider, that you cannot go beyond. Now, but interestingly, if you look at what they are, you can see that they are not divine authority or something. They are not textual authority or anything. Then what are they? The first one is Attadipateya, Atta. First one is Attadipateya, Atta, oneself. In the Kalama Sutta we found that Buddha says, Attanava janeyata, you know for yourself. And then there are other places in the discourses, Atta upavadati. What is the meaning of Atta upavadati? Upavadati means one's own conscience, Atta there. Upavadati means complain. Your own conscience complain against you. Your own conscience criticize you. Your own conscience blames you. You get the point? Like when certain things are done or certain things are not done, maybe outside people say, oh, it is good. But in your own mind, you know that what you did is wrong. Now what is that? How do you know? That is your conscience. Actually, we talk about moral conscience. Now, moral conscience can be different from people to people. Basically, your moral conscience is developed according to your moral training. If you have a very good idea of good and bad, right and wrong, what you should do and what you should not do, then from very early childhood, you develop a moral conscience. It can come from your teachers, it can come from your parents, it can come from your school, it can come from your society. So the conscience is something not that we have inherently. Conscience is something, some aspect of our understanding, aspect of our mind that is gradually developed in us. Now some people do wrong things, they don't feel anything about it, which means they don't have a conscience, or they have a very different type of conscience. But if you know that you did something wrong, even though the entire world tells you that you are good, you know that you are not good. How? Because your conscience knows that you did something wrong. So Attadipateya means that actually, Attadipateya means you look at your conscience. You hear, you listen to your conscience. You see what your conscience says. Maybe everybody else blames you, but you know that what you did is right. Your conscience says that what you did is right. Entire world may be praising you, but you know what you did is wrong. So the conscience is, the inner, how to define it? Conscience is inner feeling of good and bad, right and wrong. So all of us have some kind of conscience, but very often depending on your education, your moral education, your association and your intelligence, based on these things we have a moral conscience, right? So we think certain things are good, certain things are right and certain things are wrong and certain things are bad based on this. So Attadipateya means Buddha says that Adipateya, you come under the authority of yourself. Now this is different from coming under the authority of divine being or anything. That is the external source. But here the thing is, you can't come under your own moral consciousness. But again, you can argue that you can say that, look, moral conscience is different from different people. Some people may have a very developed moral conscience, some people may not have developed moral conscience. Moral conscience is very different among different people. Now does this mean that for each person moral consciousness is the criterion? No. Actually the Attadipateya means you have to have developed good moral conscience. Right? Otherwise, there may be some people who think that, whatever the wrong thing they did is right. That's again their conscience. So the conscience can be different actually. But basically, if a mature, morally good person's conscience will say whether what you did is right or wrong. So you go by Attadipateya. But you see that Attadipateya is not the only one. The second is Lokadipateya. Lokadipateya means you look at what the world says. What the people in the world say. Lokadipateya, Loka. What the world says. World means people in the world. Again, people in the world means not each and every person. Intelligent people. People with understanding. People with good education. People with broad outlook. Now, Lokadipateya means that. So you look at the world, what the world says. If yourself says something wrong, if the world is also saying something is wrong, then you can decide that you should not do it. And then third one is Dhammadipateya. Now the word Dhamma here I translated as teaching of the Buddha. But actually, although I translated it as teaching of the Buddha, Dhamma here means basically the Dhamma. Whether the Buddha's teaching is there or not, we can say Dhamma, what is right and wrong, is there. So the Dhammadipateya, but for the easiness of grasping it, I said the teaching of the Buddha, because teaching of the Buddha deals with what is right and wrong. But basically Dhamma means righteous thing, right thing, correct thing. Then you have to define what is the correct thing. You see? And then you will have to define what is the correct thing as maybe something that doesn't have lobha dosa moha, something that is helpful to others, oneself and others both, and so forth. So we will have to give us some kind of criterion or definition. So that is Dhamma. But anyhow, Dhamma means morality. Dhamma means good teaching. Dhamma means right and wrong. So basic morality. So it's a difficult term to translate actually. Now when we look at these three things, in this classification, while all the three are very important, the opinion of the intelligent people in the world, Vinyu Purisa, is often mentioned in the discourses as a criterion of what is good and bad. Actually, I am not going to discuss that aspect today. I will be discussing it maybe our next session with you, because Vinyu Purisa is also a very important aspect in moral reasoning. Now here, the connection is in the Kalama Sutta. We saw that Buddha saying to Kalamas, don't accept authority of the religious text or logic or anything like that. Not to accept authority. Then you might think that according to Buddhism, we don't need to accept any authority. No. Actually, there are certain authorities we have to go by. Now these authorities are oneself, the intelligent world, and also the Dhamma. For example, your elderly teacher says something, okay, this is not bad, or this is not good. Now it comes under Lokadipateya. Now your teacher is an intelligent person in the world. So when your teacher says something to be bad, you have to take it very seriously. And then if you feel also that it is bad, your teacher is also saying that it is bad, then it must be pretty surely bad. That's how you decide. Okay? Or you look at also according to the teaching of the Buddha, according to the idea of right and wrong. If you feel that that is bad, then also that is bad. So because to judge something to be right or wrong is not very easy always. Okay? Now according to this criteria, to judge something is to be wrong, you also feel that it is bad. And the intelligent people say that it is bad, and also it is bad according to the moral principles taught by the Buddha. So you judge that that particular action is bad. Opposite action you judge to be good. Okay. All right, I will wind up from here. What I try to do today is actually follow up of my discussion last week. We had foundations of Buddhist ethics. There we started with Kalama Sutta. rejecting certain authorities, and then we looked at the criteria of consequences as a Buddhist criterion. Then we looked at utilitarianism, which is a kind of consequentialism, but which comes under a lot of criticism, particularly by Kantian moral theory, categorical imperative. So if you put utilitarianism and Kant together, two are two totally opposing views. Utilitarianism says that go for something that produces maximum happiness for maximum people. And Kant says that nothing doing. Whether it produces happiness or not, you must do something universalizable, universally applicable. According to Kant's theory, something you do may be not good for you, but that is the universal principle. Then you do that. But then according to utilitarianism, no. You must go by the maximum happiness. But even according to utilitarianism, you can say that if it pleases only you, but if it doesn't please larger majority of the people, you should not do it. But then you look at the net amount of happiness that is produced. But Kant says that no. Whether it produces happiness or not, you must do something absolutely universally applicable. So, these are some of the ethical views. And then finally we come into concept of adhipateya. Adhipateya means authority, adhipati. So there can be, in making moral judgments, there can be certain authoritative things for us to consider. Now in Buddhism, you don't consider God or you don't consider any other authority, you consider yourself, your own conscience, and also the intelligent people in the world, and also the Dhamma. So these are the adhipateya or authority that we should come under when we are making moral decisions. Well, I will wind up from here. In my next discussion, I will have a little more discussion on who the Vinyu Purisa, intelligent people in the world, and then move on from there. So I'll wind up, and then afternoon we will be meeting for world religion. Now, if you have any questions or comments, we can spend. Yes, sir.
My question is related to happiness.
Okay.
There are some Buddhist discourses dealing with Buddhist sociology of happiness. I would like to know what are those doctrines and what are ingredients for Buddhist sociology of happiness.
What do you mean by Buddhist sociology of happiness? I mean, what do you mean?
In the society, how to live.
Yes, the Reverend, sociology of happiness, like how happiness criterion affects society. In fact, Buddha has taught many things, how people should be living in society, how you can make a happy life. Now, if you take Sigalovada Sutta or something, you do your duties and, things like that. So those are kind of social things. I think, Reverend, your question is not for me to explain Sigalovada Sutta, but when we look at the basic Buddhist criteria, this social happiness in society is something important that is considered in Buddhism. You're right, because it is not. Now, what is society? Now, society according to Buddhism is a collection of really individuals. So ultimately in Buddhism, we can talk about individual actions and social actions. Now, individual actions are actions you do as an individual, and then maybe they have nothing much to do with society. Individual actions can be even not moral. Now, I want to take my breakfast, I want to do my washing. Those are individual actions. They are not moral or immoral. But whenever you do something social, that action affects external people. Now, that action is a moral action because it has a moral dimension. Because whenever I deal with larger number of people, say for example, I'm going in a public bus, then that can be a moral action because there must be a proper way to behave in the public bus. But if I am going on my own private vehicle, those things are not applicable, right? So in other words, what I am trying to say is, your individual action may be not always morally binding or morally affecting society. But I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. Let me put it this way. You can have your certain individual action which do not have moral concerns, like you do your taking your meal and things like that. But every moment it has some relation to the public, it can be a moral act. In the sense, you taking your meal, it's a very personal thing. But if you take your meal in a community hall, then there is a morality. There is a way you should eat. There is how much you should eat. Suppose there is limited number of food to eat. You can't just serve yourself huge plate. You have to be considering all these people, right? So any action can be a socially affecting, influencing action depending on the situation, Reverend. So in the Buddhist ethics, actually the whole issue of ethics is society, Reverend. If we are living in like, the story Robinson Crusoe, like in island, without anybody else, you don't have to care about ethics because, there is no any other human being or other beings to care about ethics. And if you just live all by yourself, no stealing. I mean, in order to steal, there must be somebody else who has things. But if you are just by alone, can you steal? No. If you are the only person in the island, can you kill? No. Can you tell lies? No. So, all the ethics is basically social ethics, Reverend. Ethics become meaningful in society, not in privately. So, I mean, your question is important. So, I would say that not only, I mean, in a Sutta Sigalovada, you see how we should treat different social groups, but that's a different dimension. But if you take the basic ethical concept, ethics becomes meaningful only in a society. So, according to Buddhism, ethics is social. So, you need to really be concerned about, be regardful about or careful about, caring about the society in your behavior. So, that becomes ethical behavior. Okay. Okay, Reva.
Okay. My question is, why is Buddhist economics ethics?
Okay, Reverend, it's a very large question, Buddhist economics ethics. Let me go into some other time because, we don't have time really to go to Buddhist economics ethics because there is so much in Buddhism about economics because, how to earn money, how to spend money and, so that is it's an important question, but if I need to answer your question, I need another 1 hour to go on in that. But I will not try to answer it today. But of course, if you look at everything Buddha said about earning, spending, those are Buddhist economic ethics. Not only that, from the other Buddhist teachings, you can really come up with a set of ethics. Although Buddha did not teach them as economic ethics. Buddha never used this term. One example is, there is this world famous book, now it is very old, Small is Beautiful, by Schumacher. It was written in 1970s. The name of the book is Small is Beautiful. Now if you look at that book, Small is Beautiful. Just see Schumacher. Schumacher, Small is Beautiful. If you Google, you will find this book. That is where people started talking about Buddhist economics. There's a chapter. So you can read that. There's so much. So maybe in the ethics discussion, I will one day talk about economics ethics. Okay, Reverend. We will go for one more question. You had a question? Okay, okay. Because I don't want for you to lose your midday meal. Okay, okay, Reverend.
Must also do something only if it is universal applicable.
Pardon me?
You must always do something only if it is.
Yeah.
If the number of many people in the world make event or action, should I make an event or should I make what?
Okay. So your question is whether a larger majority of people in the world do something.
Something but
Yeah, actually the issue is this, Reverend. Now the Kantian view, categorical imperative means really you don't care about the larger majority or anything. It's not related to larger majority. The utilitarianism is the one that is connected to larger majority. Kant philosophy is to say that whether people like or not, you have to do the right thing. How do you buy the right thing? Okay, if you can visualize, think that this universally applicable. Actually, in my next discussion, Reverend, I will come to talk about this little bit more. For example, let me give you a brief answer to your question. I want to kill this animal, but then I don't. Why? I say that everybody loves life. Now that is a universal. So why I don't kill this animal is because everybody loves the life. Now that is a universal principle according to which I should not kill. Now for example, I should not kill this animal because this animal belongs to so and so. No, that is not the reason according to Kant. You must not kill the animal for some universal reason, universally applicable reason. You see? So this is what Kant says, something applicable universally. So in other words, you must have to have a reason universally applicable in order to do or not to do something. So according to Kant, I should not steal, not because it is your thing or somebody else's thing, because stealing is wrong according to, some universal view, something like that. Yeah. Okay, I think I will wind up from here and leaving for you to go for your meals. So we will meet afterwards to discuss world ethics. Thank you very much.